Hey everybody, welcome back to our Trout in the Classroom Virtual 2021 program. I am Jan, English Education for the Department of Wildlife, here with Amanda. She is also one of our educators here at the Department of Wildlife and AmeriCorps. She's going to talk today a little bit about trout food and predators. I am going to take a minute at the end and tie a fly to show you how and what we do in the fishing world to represent some of those fish foods. Amanda?
All right, let me start sharing my screen. Oh, that's the wrong button. All right, so I hope everyone can see my presentation. Once again, my name is Amanda Mulholland. I am an AmeriCorps member working with the Department of Wildlife. So, and this presentation is, I think, our fourth presentation, and it's going to be all about food and predators. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go over a little bit about what we're talking about. We're going to go over really quickly what a habitat is again. We're going to talk about what a food chain, a food web, a trophic pyramid is. Maybe these are some new words you're hearing. What are some sources of food for our trout? What are predators of our trout? So what eats our trout? And we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So starting with a habitat, we've already kind of covered what a habitat is. It's an area where an animal naturally, or an animal or a plant naturally lives and grows, can go through its life cycle successfully. So a habitat consists of food. It has a source of water. It has shelter, and it has space. So for our rainbow trout, our food is going to be a whole bunch of things we'll go over later. The water needs to be cold, clear, and clean. Shelter could be rocks and things, plants found in the river, and space is going to be the Truckee River, starting or going from Pyramid to Tahoe. So a food chain is essentially a chain of consumers. So what eats what? A chain is a series of events or a series. So a food chain is going to be a series that starts with our primary producers. So our primary producers are going to be things like little microscopic bacteria, fungi, things like this, and they are eaten by our primary consumers. So that's going to be, primary essentially means one. So it's where we're starting. So our primary producers, those are the ones that start the food chain. They're producing food, and then they're eaten by our primary consumers. So they're the first eaters, essentially, is what primary consumer means. And then the primary consumers are eaten by the secondary consumers. So the second consumers, the second eaters. And then our tertiary and our quaternary consumers are going to be what gets eaten next. So going over the trophic pyramid, it is basically an expansion on the food web. It is a pyramid because at the very bottom we have our primary producers, and we're going to have a lot more. Oh, my cat is meowing at me. We're going to have a ton of primary producers, and then after that we're going to have slightly less primary consumers. So we're going to have a ton of starting food, and then a little bit less of what's going to eat that starting food. And then we're going to have a little bit less of our secondary consumers, and then a little bit less of our tertiary and quaternary consumers. This is because food, essentially, as we go up, things tend to go up in size. So they're going to need to eat a lot more food to sustain something that's larger. So that's why we tend to have less at the top, because they're going to need to consume so much of what's below them that there's not enough to sustain a ton of species. And then we have our food web, which is essentially just a ton of food chains linked together. It still contains our primary consumers, our primary producers, our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and our tertiary consumers. However, they're more so linked together. So here we have it starting with plants. So plants are our primary producer. They're being eaten by the herbivores, which are our primary consumers. And then those herbivores are being eaten by secondary consumers, our carnivores. So our trout are going to be more so our tertiary consumers, or no, our secondary consumers. They're kind of in the middle. So our trout eat a variety of things. They like to eat crustaceans. They'll eat snails, leeches, and worms. They love to eat insects, and they also love to eat other fish. So these animals that you see in front of you on the screen, they're going to be eating the primary producers. So they like to eat the bacteria, the plants, the things that are growing, that scum that kind of grows on the bottom of the river. That's what these animals are going to be eating. And then our trout are going to be eating these guys. And we're mainly going to focus on our insects and our other fish today. So diving into our insects, we're going to start with an idea called complete metamorphosis. So you might have heard of metamorphosis when we're talking about butterflies, or we're talking about amphibians like frogs. They started as a tadpole, they go through a change, and they appear to become a completely different animal. However, it's just a later stage in that life cycle. So talking about complete metamorphosis, an example of this would be the butterfly. So a complete metamorphosis kind of is where an animal looks almost completely different to where it was when it was first hatched. So after hatching for a complete metamorphosis insect, or an insect that goes through complete metamorphosis, we would call them larvae. So we have our egg, it hatches, it becomes a larvae. It's not popping up. There we go. We have an egg. It hatches, it becomes a larvae. Sometimes we have special names for larvae. In the case of the butterfly, we call them caterpillars. So it hatches, it becomes a larvae. It needs to consume a ton of food. So it puts on it takes in a lot of energy, because it has to go through a pupa stage. And this is where they undergo a drastic change. In this case, we would call it a chrysalis, where the butterfly goes into a cocoon, goes through a ton of development, and then emerges as an adult butterfly. So this would be complete metamorphosis. So we know this because it consumes a ton of food and it goes through a pupa stage. So it's almost like a state of dormancy where they go through a huge change. So one of our insects that we're going to talk about is the caddisfly. Now the caddisfly is a big part of our rainbow trout diet. They love to eat the caddisfly. And it starts out as an egg, which is laid on a rock or a leaf really close to a source of water. Now after this egg hatches, they enter the water as free-living caddisfly larvae. So they're going to be consuming a ton of food while they're in the water. Depending on the species, this stage can last anywhere from a month to a year. And then once they're ready, they've consumed a ton of food, so they've stored a ton of energy, they can then go through their pupa stage. So in their pupa stage, they will adhere rocks and sometimes bits of vegetation to themselves as a source of camouflage. So they're trying to hide from predators. And typically you'll find them on rocks where they're gathered together in these clumps, and they look kind of weird. They're just little insects that are covered in rocks. And then they become an adult. So in the pupa stage, in the pupa stage, this is when they're growing their wings. So underneath all of those stones, they're beginning to develop wings. And then when they emerge from their pupa, they now are an adult with fully formed wings. In this stage, sometimes they don't consume any food. It depends on the species, of course, but some species will eat nectar, and other adults of the caddisfly won't consume any food at all. Their primary focus on when they become an adult is to mate and produce more eggs. So they don't even have a mouth sometimes. So our caddisfly is now an adult. It is going to try to find a mate. And after it mates, it's going to lay eggs on a leaf and start the whole cycle all over again. Sometimes they're an adult for a couple of weeks to a month. So they're really not an adult for the most part of their life cycle. Most of their life cycle is going to be spent as a free living caddisfly larvae or an enclosed caddisfly pupa. So our next type of metamorphosis we're going to talk about is incomplete metamorphosis. So we see this in our dragonfly. So with incomplete metamorphosis, after the egg hatches, it becomes a nymph. So it's not a larvae. A larvae is when it goes through complete metamorphosis. And it doesn't go through a chrysalis or a pupa stage. It doesn't pupate. That's what we call it when it goes through a pupa stage. It's called pupating. But these guys are not going to pupate. They're going to molt instead. And after they molt, they're going to go through a series of molts as they grow bigger. And after a certain point, when they've put on enough energy, they're going to be able to molt and develop wings. So here we have our beautiful adult dragonfly. So one example of an insect that our rainbow trout love to eat, they will also eat dragonfly and dragonfly nymphs. But one other insect is the mayfly. So the mayfly will lay its eggs on a leaf, on the surface of water. And these eggs are going to sink to the bottom. They're going to attach themselves to vegetation. They're a little bit sticky, so they're going to attach themselves to vegetation and rocks. And after they hatch, they're going to look kind of like this. So this is a mayfly nymph. Remember, we said that if it doesn't go through a chrysalis or a pupate stage, we call them a nymph after they hatch. So here we have our mayfly nymph. So I always know if I'm looking at a mayfly because it has those three tails or those three antennae coming off of its butt. And if you kind of look at it like that, it's going to be like an M. So it's going to look like like an M for mayfly. That's how I identify a mayfly nymph personally. So these bugs are going to hang out on rocks until they come up to the surface of water to go through that molt where they develop their wings. Now their wings are going to take some time to dry off. So during this state, they're really vulnerable to any predator like a rainbow trout that would try to come along and eat them because they're just hanging out on the surface of water. So they're really vulnerable. Now they can stay in the nymph stage for up to 2 years. Some insects, however, will only be in that stage for about a month. So in the emergent stage, they're going to be emerging from their molts, drying off their wings, and then they'll fly away as adults. So adults still tend to hang out on the surface of water. They'll be adults for a couple of months until they eventually find a mate. After they mate, they will lay on the surface of water. They're pretty much collapsed from exhaustion. Producing eggs and mating takes a lot out of these insects. So they essentially collapse on the surface of water where they make prime food for our rainbow trout. And the cycle starts over. So some other insects that also go through incomplete metamorphosis would be, like we said, our dragonfly nymph. These are a primary source of our trout's diet. We have our stonefly. So our stoneflies are another primary source of our trout's diet. They look kind of like a mayfly nymph. However, they're only going to have 2 tails. They also like to hang out in rocks and stuff, but they're only going to have 2 tails. Meanwhile, our mayfly is going to have 3 tails and form that M. And then we have our damselfly. So some people wonder what's the difference between a dragonfly and a damselfly. They both are carnivorous insects, so they like to eat other insects. And one of the main identifiers is really going to be that dragonfly wings stick out to the sides. Meanwhile, damselfly wings will be straight back. So as you can kind of see here, the wings are straight back on the damselfly, and over here on our dragonfly, it has wings that stick out to the sides. So now we're going to get into some of the fish that our trout love to eat. So we've got our Paiute sculpin. We've got our chewy chub. We've got our brown trout, our sunfish, our mountain whitefish, and yes, our trout, our rainbow trout, will even eat other rainbow trout. They are not picky. All of these fish can be smaller than the rainbow trout, and the rainbow trout, when hungry, will eat whatever will fit in its mouth, including other fish of the same species. So we've got our predators. So now we're shifting from what do the trout eat to what eats our trout. So our main natural predator is going to be birds. Our birds are probably the biggest predator of most fish out there. We have the osprey. Now, I love this photo because the osprey looks totally crazy, just when he's looking directly at the camera. Well, the osprey has this really cool adaptation where when it picks up the fish, it will angle the fish so that it's facing straight ahead. And this makes it more aerodynamic to be able to fly through the air faster and more efficiently. So it's pretty cool to watch them pick up a trout because they'll just hang on to it with it facing forward instead of grabbing it and having it be sideways like a lot of our other birds of prey will do. We have our belted kingfisher. So our belted kingfisher is a smaller bird, maybe around the size of a dove, a little bit larger. And so they're mainly going to be eating our trout when they're in that fry stage, when they're in that juvenile stage. So they're not quite large enough to escape being eaten by our belted kingfisher. And these birds are really well adapted to be able to dive into the water. So they'll dive, well, they'll sit on a branch. Their head can be immobilized so the branch could be moving, but their head will stay still. And they will watch that the little fish swimming around. And once they've targeted one, they will dive into the water and grab it and then fly away. So they are very well adapted to be able to dive and attack our smaller fish. And then we also have our American pelican. So out on Pyramid Lake, we have a breeding colony of American pelicans. They live on an island. They breed by the thousands. They're one of the only islands and areas where American pelicans are known to breed in the US. So we do have a rather large population, and they're going to be out there searching around, working in groups. So they'll locate a group of fish. They'll swim around it to kind of corral all of those fish into a certain area. They'll fly up into the air and then dive down at them in kind of a coordinated attack to be able to catch as many fish as possible. So they're very smart predators. And then we have some of our aquatic mammal predators. So our aquatic mammals would be our North American river otter. These are one of my favorite mammals. They're super cute, but they're also ferocious. Look at those teeth. They will definitely dig into our trout. It's definitely one of their favorite meals is going to be the rainbow trout. And we also have the American mink. So the mink might not catch bigger trout, but they'll definitely be catching the smaller trout that they can. And they're both very well adapted to be able to swim through the water. So you can see they have that slim body, and that enables them to be able to move quickly and accurately through the water. Our North American river otter can definitely move with more accuracy as they can actually see underwater. Our American mink has to target that prey above water and then go at it below. So it doesn't always get the prey. So our next predator we're going to talk about is our black bear. So our black bears don't necessarily always predate on trout. To be honest, our black bears are pretty lazy. They're gonna go for more insects. They're gonna try to eat more vegetation like plants and berries and things like that. But they will take advantage of exhausted fish. So when our kokanee salmon, which we have in Lake Tahoe, tried to go to spawn up in Taylor Creek, they have to jump upstream. So they're going to be jumping up waterfalls, they're going to be jumping up the little creeks, and our bears know this. So they'll be there waiting for the trout to jump out of the water right into their mouths, pretty much. So that's where our black bears will really eat a fish. They won't really eat our trout unless the opportunity arises. Maybe a dead trout washes up on the river. They're definitely going to want to eat that. Maybe some other animal has abandoned their kill and has left this trout. They're going to take advantage of that. They're more so scavengers, but they will definitely love to come and take advantage of the kokanee salmon runs that occur, I think, in the fall. So this occurs in the fall, and our bears will gather around this creek ready to eat the salmon as they swim upstream. Now, humans are definitely predators, and we're very smart predators. We can plan, we can think, we can make connections, and because of this, we've been able to mimic trout prey. So here we have an example of our mayfly going through emergence, and a fly that looks very similar to that. So our fly looks very similar to an emerging mayfly, an emerging mayfly. We also have lures and bait that's going to look really similar to the adult stages. So this is our stonefly. It looks really similar to this lure. And then in the spinner stage, again, we are really good at mimicking our trout's natural food as a fishing mechanism. We also have learned to use bait. So some people will fish with worms, and in certain places you can fish with live bait like our Paiute sculpin. So today we covered a whole bunch of information. We talked about what makes a habitat. So it has to have food, water, shelter, space, and we really focused on what that food was. We learned about the food chain, our trophic webs, and the trophic pyramid. So our food chain is that direct link. It's what eats the next thing. And then our food web is that connected food chain. And then we have our trophic pyramid, which is essentially the food chain or the food web, but with how many animals are in each stage. We talked about what trout eat. So we mainly focused on our insects and those very interesting life cycle adaptations they have, like incomplete and complete metamorphosis. We talked about what eats our trout. So we talked about natural predators like our aquatic mammals, like our avian predators, our birds. And we also talked about our abnormal predators. So like us, we're not natural. We didn't evolve with them, but we are definitely a predator of the trout. So I hope you all enjoyed this presentation today. And if you have any questions, I can definitely address anything that's left over. So after I address some questions, I am going to kind of dive into the activity a little bit that got paired with this. So survival of the fittest activity. I'm just going to go over it briefly, and then at the end of that, Jan will do his fly tying. So someone said, what kind of stuff do these mayflies do? So mayflies, they are a pollinator sometimes. If they do live, if they do consume nectar, because some of our mayflies do consume nectar, they will be a pollinator. They are a great source of food, not only for our trout, but also other insect-eating things that are going to be hanging out near the water. Like we could even talk about bats. Bats are going to be eating them. But generally, mayflies are just going to be hanging out near the water, They also are a primary consumer, so they're going to be eating that detritus, the waste that builds up on the bottom of our rivers. So they are definitely important, not only as a source of food for other things, but also as for consuming that detritus, that waste at the bottom of our rivers. Someone said, do they lay eggs at the same time? So depending on the species, it's actually really cool because I know that our mayflies, depending on what species it is, on the East Coast, there is a species of mayfly that will lay their eggs all at the same time, and they will all go through a giant emergence. So they'll all emerge at the same time from the water as a giant cloud of bugs. Kind of frightening, but it happens every year. Someone said, why are trouts called trouts? That's a great question. I do not know the answer. I'll look it up after this. Someone said, can a trout bite a human? Yes. They have mouths. Anything with a mouth can definitely bite. How much do trout eat? They have to eat a ton. So while they're growing, they're going to have to consume as many insects as they possibly can to be able to grow, and as much food as it's able to get will be able to accelerate how quickly it grows. So if it can get more food, it'll definitely grow faster. Someone said, are rainbow trout rainbow, or are they just glossy and silver? They're kind of more of this glossy and silver color. However, they do have like a reddish hue that goes through them and a bluish hue that kind of goes through them. And kind of like a greenish. So they're kind of multicolored. It's not very bright, but it was enough of a distinction that we decided to call them rainbow trout. Someone said, someone asked, or basically mentioned, that humans are the top level of the food chain, and yes, we have a ton of tools. We've kind of removed ourselves from the food chain, I like to say. We shouldn't really be considered a part of it because we are an apex predator. We have tools, we have cognitive thinking, so we're able to make plans, we're able to make decisions, problem solving skills, things that animals aren't going to have. So yes, we're definitely at the top of the food chain, if not removed from it completely.
We have another good question that says, when does the life cycle of the trout start? Is it when the eggs are spawned or when the eggs hatch?
That is a great question, and I'm sure it could probably be debated among scientists. I'd probably say it's when the eggs are spawned in the case of fish, or when the eggs are fertilized by the male. So that's a great question. I will have to look into it more. Jan, do you have any input on that?
I think my answer would be the same.
Yeah, I think it's probably debatable, depending on your viewpoint, I guess. You could say that it's when the eggs are laid because they have now come into existence, but you could also say that if those eggs never get fertilized, then the trout cycle doesn't really begin. So they have to be fertilized to be able to even begin growing. So I'd say probably when the eggs are fertilized, in my opinion. That was a good question.
Yeah, another good question is, do fish provide milk to their babies?
No. So mammals are the only type of animal that produces milk and gives it to their babies. So no, our trout, as soon as they hatch and as soon as they absorb their egg sacs, they're going to be trying to consume as many little insects as they possibly can. Where are mayfly habitat? So we're going to find our mayfly where water is going to be, but they really need clean water. That's a great question because they do need that clean water. So we use our insects, like our mayflies, as an indicator as to whether or not water is going to be clean enough for our trout to survive. Because if those insects can survive, probably means our trout are going to be able to survive in that area too, because the water is clean enough for them to do so. That was a good question. So we're going to find them near streams, near rivers, typically where rushing water is. Sometimes we'll find them in our lakes, in our river, in our ponds if the water is clean enough as well. Someone asked if reptiles eat trout. So we do have our garter snakes. Garter snakes love to eat little fish. So yes, I could have included that in there. I didn't even think about that. But yes, our garter snakes will eat reptiles should the opportunity. Or sorry, our garter snakes will eat baby fish should they find any. What is the oldest mayfly? So mayfly life cycles are really short. The maximum they're going to live is going to be 2 years. And that's really pushing it. Most of our mayflies are going to live a couple of months to a year, 2 years at the most.
Jan, you might know the answer to this one. Sorry, Amanda. Why a mayfly is called a mayfly? I think it's because they typically hatch in May, right?
So that is a great question. That sounds pretty good. I'd go with that one. As far as knowing the answer to that, I actually don't know it. I'm gonna have to look that one up as well. I know that the cloud on the East Coast is a hex, Hexgenia limbata or something. That I know that mayfly is that, but I don't know why it's called a mayfly.
That's a great question.
Good question.
Someone asked what mayflies and caddisflies eat. So like I said, they're going to be eating that what we call detritus. So it's going to be all that waste that collects at the bottom of a river. Sometimes this is fish poop. Sometimes it's just decomposed plants and such. Sometimes they'll also eat plants as well. Someone asked, what do trouts do for the ecosystem? So they provide a lot in the way of providing food for other predators. So without our trout, if we were going to, so we can basically ask this, what would our ecosystem look like if we didn't have trout? So if we didn't have trout, we wouldn't have food for our predators, but we would probably also have a ton of insects. Because if these insects aren't getting eaten by our trout, they're going to be able to increase their population into huge numbers. So we'd probably get a giant boom in the insect population. And then there probably wouldn't be enough food to continue to sustain that giant insect population. So then the insects might die off the next year. So that could happen. That's one thing. Also, our predators would probably begin to die off, mainly our fish specializing predators. So like our river otter, like our pelican, predators like those. So they're very important for our ecosystem, just being a key part of it. And also, trout are a giant source of recreation. So we get a lot of money from people who buy fishing equipment, from people who buy fishing licenses, and that money is able to go back into keeping our ecosystems clean, stocking rivers and things with more fish, so that way people can continue to recreate. So just by the trout, just by fishing alone, it allows the ecosystem to continue going. For it to continue to receive human financial support, so money to back ecosystems to continue thriving.
Awesome job. Well, I think we got to most of the big questions. If you want to go ahead and go on with the next activity, and then we'll pass it on to Jan after that.
All right, so this was our survival of the fittest activity. It's kind of an extension of this presentation. You are not required to do it, but if you have it and if you're ready to go through it, I'm just going to briefly go over what it is. So trout in the wild, they face so many threats as they're trying to complete their life cycle and successfully spawn in their home streams. So they're going to face so many threats to their life cycles. And this worksheet is basically an example of what those threats are and maybe how many are actually going to survive through their life cycle. So we're going to follow the statements and figure out how many trout will survive each stage. So we are going to start out with 2,500 eggs. So we have our female, she's going to her stream, she successfully made it there, she has laid her eggs, and we have 2,500 eggs that have been laid. So on your paper, it'll say, remember the trout life cycle: egg, alvin, fry, juvenile, and adult. So next to adult, if you have your worksheet, I want you to write down what your guess is. So we have 2,500 eggs. Do you think that all 2,500 eggs are going to survive to adulthood to be able to spawn again? Or do you think maybe only 1,000 are going to survive? Maybe only 100, maybe only 10. So write down your guess as to how many are going to survive to adulthood. So your worksheet will look like this. Our first question is, or our first statement is, an adult female trout makes several reds and lays 2,500 eggs, and a male comes along and fertilizes them. 150 eggs do not get fertilized. So how many made it? So we're going to subtract 150 from 2,500 eggs. And if you have your worksheet, this has already been given to you. So we now have 2,350 fertilized eggs. So these eggs are now able to start developing into a trout. So they have begun their life cycle. A trout of a different species finds some eggs that have floated away from the security of their redd. So maybe the river was a bit too harsh and it has washed away a couple of those eggs. And this trout comes along, finds the eggs, and this trout decides to eat 50 eggs. So they've eaten 50 eggs, and we now have 2,300 fertilized eggs. So you're going to continue subtracting the eggs as they go through each state. So maybe they face predation, maybe we tried to go fishing, maybe there's pollution. They're going to go through many things as they're developing. So you're going to complete this worksheet, and afterwards I want you to discuss with your neighbors, maybe discuss with your teacher, how many trout survived from adulthood to spawn. Did you think that many trout were going to survive, or did you maybe underestimate or overestimate how many trout are going to survive? So that is the goal of our worksheet, is to essentially talk about how many trout actually survive to adulthood and whether or not we guessed accurately. All right, and that is the end of my little brief walkthrough. And Jan, do you want to go ahead and take over from here?
Absolutely. All right. Okay, so Amanda covered predators and prey, and I felt that including a little extra on the prey, certainly my form of trout prey, or imitations of trout prey. So we're going to talk a little bit about flies. We touched base a little bit last week on fly fishing, the actual sport of it, but I thought we would actually put together a fly today, just to give you a little idea of how everything kind of goes together. Okay, the prey that we are going to imitate today is a crayfish, and the type of fly that we're going to do that with is called a woolly bugger. A woolly bugger is probably the most popular fly that ever existed, and it's because it imitates so many different things. It imitates prey from leech to bait fish to those bottom feeder fish that we saw, crayfish. It can imitate a whole slew of things. All right, the materials we're going to use are some turkey feathers. You can use some stuff called chenille, and it's found at like the craft store. It's used to make blankets, scarves, all kinds of fun stuff. Very crafty. And then we're going to use a rooster feather that is dyed a very pretty color. And all the colors are going to kind of look the same hue as the crayfish. Okay, so you saw me wrapping thread around the hook really, really quickly. That's just to go ahead and build up a foundation to put the material on. So I've got my thread down. I'm going to use that same thread to secure the different materials in place. So we've got our tail. We've got that crafty material for our body. Then we have our rooster feather. Which is called our hackle. All right, now there's a big mess here. We're going to put it together. So I'm going to start with my blanket material, my chenille. That's our body. And again, I'm wrapping everything around the hook to keep it secure and using my thread to make sure it doesn't come undone. And then finally, we'll put our hackle on. This kind of gives the fly a look of almost like legs. If you've seen crayfish, they swim backwards with their claws behind them. So this big kind of poof really does a pretty good job imitating that backward swimming crayfish. And that is our woolly bugger. I could probably take a minute to answer any questions maybe on those, if there are any.
Awesome. Well, since we have gotten through all of the questions, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Jan and Amanda. That was awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Hope you guys enjoyed it.